Welcome to Unboxing the RDOF Toolkit. In this video, we're going to speak very briefly about the documentation and the components to the toolkit. We're then going to step you through a number of visuals showing what you can do with the data, and this will hopefully motivate the reader and showcase a lot of the capability. Finally, we will go through each of the data sets and show exactly what's included and how it might be used. The RDOF Toolkit is a very, very powerful set of analytics, which is both a visual tool and a set of spreadsheets. Is designed for those who are participating in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund RDOF auction and are seeking to analyze different bidding areas and build business cases and basically approach the subject with a very, very rich set of analytics. In the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss what you see when you open up the toolkit, and starting with a lot of visuals, and then stepping through to the controls that are included in the toolkit. So when you open it, you'll see and unzip the spreadsheets, you'll see a visual toolkit that we'll explore momentarily, and you also see a set of Excel spreadsheets, and also importantly, some documentation. The introduction is a lengthy document with a lot of graphics. It's a terrific educational tool, and by the way, you can download it without actually purchasing the toolkit if you want to have a better understanding of what's included. Getting Started Guide is a shorter, more practical piece, just showing you how to get set up and running, and again, both of those you can download. So when you open the tool, here are some of the views that are readily available. So this is very, very simple. It just shows the RDOF eligible areas as bright green across the national backdrop. And of course, as a GIS tool, you just spin your thumb wheel on your mouse and you'll zoom in. You can also look at this from the perspective of what areas are biddable versus not. So in the white areas, which cover cities and typically more more populous areas, these are areas that don't have any uncovered geographies, and therefore these are block groups that where there are no eligible block groups within RDOF. You can also juxtapose the two. So for instance, here if we look at Wyoming, we'll see some white areas which represent entire block groups that you can't bid on, or in many cases several block groups. But then a lot of other areas where the green represents the portion of a block group that is RDOF eligible, but there are other blocks within that block group that are not. And as you can see, a lot of the country actually falls in that category. So these are some of the very basic views. You can also look at things using centroid pins, and the reason we've included this kind of analysis here is first of all, with a pin, when you zoom in and out, the size of the pin doesn't change. And so this means that even if there is just a tiny area that that is required to be covered, and in some cases this might be as small as a small fraction of an acre, where it would basically be one house, you will still see that because it'll appear as a pin. And also within larger geographic areas, you'll also see clustering of pins in certain areas which represent typically large populations that are eligible to be covered. So this is just another view, but a very useful one. Here is an example where we've zoomed in a little bit, and here you can see that we've got pieces of 4 states. We have Oregon, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah. We have roads that we can turn on and off. We have right now locations toggled on. There are a bunch of different data sets that are possible. And you see a lot of bare earth. You also see some of this interesting blue color, but it's actually not uniformly blue. You'll see some other colors here, and here you'll see, for instance, some richness of color. So this is, these colored areas are actually visualizing the housing unit density. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, such as right here, you'll see that as you look at these areas that have a little bit of color and you start zooming in, that in fact they have a lot of color, and you just don't see it at a higher zoom level. You can also toggle the data sets. In this case, we've toggled it to from locations to housing units, and in some cases it's exactly the same, in some cases it's a little bit different, but locations conceptually are you know, housing units, or basically residences plus businesses. And as you go through the documentation for the model, you'll see a lot of discussion of how you can validate that with the data within the toolkit, and what you need to look out for. Finally, as we zoom in a little bit further, we've now turned on housing unit data at a block level. So now you can see a lot of uncovered structures in this area and fewer here. And you know, the color represents the density. And so this gives you kind of a lot of visibility. Just going back to another view. So this is again a portion of a couple of different states. Here we've got Oregon and Idaho. In this case, we have the eligible areas turned on in green. So in each of these green areas, this is a combination of full blocks and partial blocks. We also have ineligible block groups turned on with sort of a cloudy white. So these are entire areas where you simply can't bid because there are 0 eligible locations. And then in each of these areas that are bounded by a magenta line, these are all block groups. And so here we have, you know, for instance, you know, six locations, 15, 1, 1, 1. So this gives you a view, and within many of these block groups, like here we have 1,400 locations, which is a pretty good number. Here we have 6, but a giant area. So that gives you some perspective. If we turn on the pins, which we mentioned earlier, this is actually very helpful. So in this big area here, we see that we've got some tiny pieces that are actually all partial block groups, but a total of 6 locations total. So not a huge amount of opportunity. In this area, we've got 1,400 locations, but what's interesting is they're not uniformly distributed. In fact, a lot are distributed in a small area. And again, this is very helpful to just think about the engineering design and how you're going to cover that. And then we also see that there are, you know, here sort of scattered opportunities. Another way to look at this is we can toggle it so that the full block and partial block groups have different colors. So in this case, full block groups are shown in orange, partials in yellow, and in this case you have the dividing lines between the block groups that are visible. So it becomes a lot more obvious where those boundaries are, and you know, where there are a lot of block groups, typically there are a lot of potential customers as well. So that's an indication. In this view, we've turned off this area here, which was ineligible, and we can see from the satellite view that it is most likely an urbanized area. As we continue to toggle things on, we can look at competitive dynamics. So here we have fiber. So you can see a lot of fiber, existing fiber built out here and here and here. And what's interesting too is even in some of your areas that are eligible RDOF block groups, you've got just 1 or 2 or 4 locations. And basically what we know from this competitive information, because we can see the fiber presence, these are areas that an incumbent fiber provider missed. So if you're thinking about that, you would think about this area very, very differently than if it were in the middle of the desert and there were no sort of strong competition there. We can also look at competition through a slightly different lens. So here in gray, we're showing some of the CAF2 awards, and in particular, these were the high latency areas in gray. So these are basically areas that are being covered by a geosynchronous satellite provider in nearly 100% of the cases. And what's interesting here is these CAF2 awards often abut some of the RDOF eligible areas. And so you could envision someone who goes in and wins some of these RDOF areas, could potentially extend their coverage into some of these CAF2 areas, which by definition are, were not served prior to CAF2, and and any kind of terrestrial solution would most likely beat a satellite solution, and we know that this is sort of high latency geosynchronous satellite. So this also gives some ideas of how you should think about these juxtaposition of areas. Another thing that we have that we'll show you in greater detail when we look at the tools is basically a filtering capability. So here what we've done is we've turned on the system to filter all of the RDOF areas and to show in sort of the bare areas. So it's whiting out the areas that don't qualify based on your filtering criteria and showing as transparent areas that do. But it's showing here all of the areas that have 5 housing units per square kilometer. And it does this calculation based on the sum of the full blocks and the partial blocks within each bidding area. And again, it can arrive at this calculation only by doing a vast number of spatial calculations, which and all of that data is built into the tool. So this is very, very powerful if you're approaching the market and saying we have a particular technology and we know this technology is most cost effective in these kinds of densities, or perhaps with a minimum number of households, or conversely, if you're a geosynchronous satellite provider, you may want to exclude areas that are dense beyond a certain point because you know that other people would be competing with you for those. Here's another view, and this is just an example of the many different ways you can view data within the model. So here we have state boundaries in sort of a harder magenta picture, and we have, it looks like, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. The smaller magenta boundaries are block groups, and in this case the data that we have turned on is the percentage geographic coverage within the block group, and we've also turned on coloring for block groups. So for instance, in this area that has, this is a block group here because it's bounded by magenta, and it shows 29% geographic coverage, which visually looks about right, and all of that block group is shown in a reddish color. If we go next door, we have a sort of a purple color for the block group, and it's 50.7% covered. You have other areas like here, you've just got one tiny little area and it's 0.7% of the total. So your economics of covering a block group, particularly if you're using a terrestrial technology, is oftentimes greatly influenced by the percentage of that block group, the percentage of area, and the percentage of pops that you're covering. And you can actually turn on labels for all of that, as well as, in many cases, see it visually. This is essentially the same picture, but with a satellite background in the background. And this is a different geographic location, but you can essentially see how it works. This is another feature that's extremely important. A lot of people, when they look at something like RDOF and say, where should we, where should we bid and where should we try to build and so forth. One of the questions that people are inclined to ask is, are there economies of scale between adjacent areas? And it's a natural kind of question. And so one of the capabilities we've built into the tool is what we call a cluster analysis, where you can choose among several different buffer sizes, and basically what the tool does is it takes each of the actual eligible areas, which may be large or they may be tiny splinters of geography, and if you've set it to a kilometer or to 5 kilometers, for example, it'll draw a buffer around those, and then it'll bleed areas together that touch at that point in time. And it then color codes the whole set, you know, on a national basis, and then it filters it. In this case, we've got it filtered for we have it for the top 50 clusters within the U.S. And so in this case, you know, this area that's sort of magenta is an area that could, you know, with certain assumptions, be built out as a contiguous operation. And this as well, and this as well, and their colors indicate that they're different properties. And if we turn on, you know, some other layers, we'll see here, these are the actual RDOF qualifying areas, and you can see the space around this that's colored is the buffer. So again, this is a very, you know, powerful and a very objective way of looking at the nation and saying, you know, where do significant economies of scale exist. And also, there's another layer that's not unique to, you know, the RDOF auction, but is worth noting. And this is a tool that visualizes opportunity zones. So opportunity zones were created by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to spur economic development and job creation in distressed communities. Opportunity zones have been designated in all 50 states and in every inhabited U.S. territory. So American Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And investors basically benefit from a deferral of capital gains. And so in this case here, the transparent areas are opportunity zones. And so and they're basically done at a tract level. So any RDOF eligible area would be either fully contained within an opportunity zone or not. And so here we can see, and these are the last 4 digits of the block group designation, but we can see within Missouri, you know, these are the block groups that are all within opportunity zones. And so anyone building that work and investing within those zones would enjoy certain tax advantages in addition to the actual RDOF subsidies. And so this is something to be aware of, and it may influence your business case. Here we have a live model, and we're going to use this primarily to just step through the different layers of data. And at this point, we've shown you a lot of visuals, so this should be relatively intuitive. So some of them, just to go from top to bottom, we have geographic areas, so you can turn on boundaries. So for instance, if you wanted to look at, you know, every block group, you could do that, you know, and you can typically show boundaries just by themselves or with codes. So the Census Bureau uses what's called a FIPS code, and you know, that's something that you can turn on. And then also with names for boundaries that have names, like states do, congressional districts, so forth. There are also a set of layers which are FCC license areas. And again, this is something that is relevant to someone who is using wireless technology and may own license. If you're, you know, building fiber, you're probably a lot less interested. But there are a number of different sizes of areas that are commonly used for licenses. These can be shown by themselves with a number, with a name, or with both. Also, roads can be turned on either without or without you know, labels. So you can and also very importantly, when you go, we'll talk in a moment about the maps, but you can toggle between just a satellite only map, which we see here, or a hybrid, or a traditional road map, or no map at all. So there are lots of choices there, and depending on your choice, you may or may not want to actually visualize roads, but they're there. Opportunity zones we talked about. So you can, so I'm going to turn off right now just each of these layers here. And with opportunity zones, you can click on them and see where the zones are, or conversely, you can show them as transparent areas. And the advantage of transparent areas is you can have other types of analytics running within the tool that visualizes beneath that. We mentioned previously that you can show points. And so the orange colored points are full blocks, the yellow are partial. You can also, filter, as we indicated, for areas that meet certain criteria. So let's say if we wanted to look at 10 housing units per square meter, areas that are blank, basically deliver that. And again, in this way, it's calculating just within the RDOF eligible areas. So you may have a large geography and a small portion of it is actually RDOF eligible. So this density calculation applies to those eligible areas, because that's where you would deploy fiber or wireless, or if you were deploying a terrestrial technology, and that would often be what drives your economics. And you can do that with either metric or imperial units, and you can also constrain it to have a minimum number of FCC locations as well, since you may conclude that to build out an area you need a certain minimum. You can also turn on certain boundaries. So let's say if we wanted block groups, which are the bidding areas, there they are, or you could have it with a lighter color, a thinner line basically. And you can also have block group IDs, either 4 digits or 12 digits. And again, this is just to help you keep oriented. By default, it ships with the covered area turned on in green, but again, there are lots of choices here. We showed how you could turn it on with colors. So here you've got colored block groups. And then very importantly, within the model, what it does is it also shows you at a block level. So let's say here we've got the full blocks in orange and partial in yellow. So the FCC, when they produce their shape files, they ship sort of a complex shape file for each block group. But what we've done in building the tool is we've broken it down and disaggregated it into full blocks and partial blocks, and within partial blocks, even pieces of partial blocks, and then we've run numbers against each of those. So it's very, very powerful. We showed a moment ago how you can visualize, for instance, the housing unit density. So this all looks sort of bluish, but in fact, there are little pieces of color, and if we zoomed in, we'd see a lot of color there. And there are other things that you can visualize with color, which I won't go through. The cluster analysis we talked about with different types of buffer sizes that you can turn on. And again, this is all described in the literature, which is downloadable for free before you buy the tool. Also, numerical data. There's tons of information at both the block group level and at the block level. So for instance, you've got locations and reserve price, which of course, is provided by the FCC. And again, it's a little bit busy at this level, but and normally when you display something like that, we would also be displaying boundaries. So for instance, right there, we've got some block groups turned on. But that's one of actually just a multitude of data sets we can display. We could also show the block group totals. So this is not just the covered areas, but the amount within the block groups. So if you look at the total number of housing units, and again, this is something you probably look at it at a more zoomed in level, but you can see that. You can also look at the estimated number of units that are actually covered. So these are the same metrics, but they are just a sum of the areas that are specifically covered in RDOF eligible areas. In some cases, you can see multiple metrics at once if you want. You look at ratios. What percentage of housing units within a block group, for instance, are covered? What percentage of population is covered? And then we can go down and do similar kinds of things at a block level. So this gets very, very granular. And oftentimes in an urbanized area, a block could be literally a block. So it could be a very small area. We showed some visuals on competitive technology. So here we've got just existing, and this is from FCC Form 477, filtered and visualized. But basically, you've got fiber, cable, DSL, WISP, satellite, and you've got different speeds. And again, the limitation just of the underlying data set is that it'll show a block covered if it has some coverage, and of course the FCC is looking at it, investigating and considering other types of paradigms. But this still, when you look at this compared to a block group level, it still gives you a spectacular amount of insight, and may be very decisive in helping you choose to either bid or not bid on a particular block group, or at least understand what's going on there. CAF2, you can look at both the speed and the latency, and also areas that were not awarded. There were some that were not awarded. In terms of the background visualization, if you wanted to make everything black, you could, and that's actually helpful for seeing subtle pieces in the overlay, so it just removes the background as a distraction. You can choose from a lot of different satellite providers, and then finally there are a number of different databases that are used to visualize. And in some cases here, you may want to you can actually take them and save them as an Excel spreadsheet, for instance. Most actually are provided already as Excel spreadsheets within the tool, but if there's pieces of information that you're missing, you can have direct access there. So anyway, hopefully this is a useful example of what's within the RDOF toolkit. And the next slide that you're going to see shows the URL to download it. And we would greatly encourage anyone who's interested to also download for free the Getting Started manual, and importantly the introduction, because that goes through a lot of the methodology and the data sets and will greatly educate you. And of course, give us a call if you would like to have a Zoom meeting to understand the tool further.